JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 3, Stardust Crusaders, was the part that introduced the power system of stands to the series, and I think that really shows. More than any other part, the quality of Part 3 stands varies wildly in my opinion, from some that I still consider among my favorites in the series, to others that I think are utter hot garbage, and everything in between. But there is one Part 3 stand in particular that I want to talk about today, one stand that I think stands out from the entire rest of the part. One stand that I think has a significant effect on how Araki designs stands going forward, and my favorite stand from the parts. Today, we're talking about the importance of Noriaki Kakyoin's Hierophant Green. In my video on Dio's World, I mentioned how I believed that Araki's best designed stands had one particularly exploitable weakness or condition. Think Highway Star's speed limit or Grateful Dead's ability being weakened by lower temperatures. And I stand by that. Partially. I honestly don't know how I managed to miss one of the key features of Araki's stand design, but I somehow overlooked the multitude of amazing stands that follow a completely different design philosophy. That philosophy being using a simple but creative and unique ability as a base for the stand, and then expanding upon that ability with more complex usages for said ability as the stand is used more. Some of my favorite examples of this philosophy being applied are Pesci's Beach Boy and Sandman's In a Silent Way. But it's also the category that most main character stands fall into. Well, most main character stands post Part 3, anyway. If you look at the Crusader stands, especially Star Platinum, Magician's Red, and Silver Chariot, neither of Araki's major philosophies for making good stands are really present. These abilities aren't simple in concept, complex in execution, they're simple in concept, simple in execution. Star Platinum is Fast Strong Punch Man, Chariot is Fast Sword Man, and Magician's Red is Firebird Man. These abilities are very rarely applied in any creative way. Heck, arguably Avdol's most creative uses of his ability in the series is making a hole and then sending more fire through that hole. It's also no wonder that far and away Jotaro's two best fights in the part are the ones that prevent him from just directly punching his opponent to victory. The range difference against Endduel and being forced to play by Darby's rules in a poker game. Just for the record, I do think Araki improved on this design as Part 3 went on. Iggy's the Fool and Pet Shop's Horus can both be applied in multiple different ways, all under the same umbrella of a basic elemental ability, Sand for Iggy and Dice for Pet Shop, albeit this is less creative than what Araki uses later on, but it's still a step forward. However, the oddball here seems to be Hierophant. Now, I'm sure you're thinking to yourself that Hierophant's ability isn't really cohesive, nor does it fall underneath the umbrella of a simple ability applied in multiple creative ways. After all, it has its extreme range, it has the Emerald Splash, it has its weird tentacle things, and it has its possession. But 3 of those 4 fall underneath the same ability. I don't know why this is, but for some reason everyone seems to overlook the fact that Hierophant's primary ability is unraveling itself. Whenever Kakyoin sends out Hierophant over a long distance, we're shown it either unraveling its lower torso entirely or one of its feet. It possesses people by unraveling itself and then entering them, and those tentacles are unraveled parts of its own body. It's a simple ability applied in multiple ways, and it's able to be like this because Hierophant isn't too powerful. Look at the 3 stands of the Crusaders that I mentioned earlier. Star Platinum, Silver Chariot, and Magician's Red are all pretty strong in their own right. It comes down to a sort of if it ain't broke, don't fix it mentality. These abilities are so strong that if you want the character to apply them creatively, then you have to put them in a situation where they're forced to, because otherwise, nothing's stopping Jotaro from taking out every opponent with sheer force, which he already does to a good handful of Stardust Crusaders' minor villains. By making Hierophant weaker, Araki forces himself to apply it creatively throughout his fights. But before I go more in depth on specific fights, I should probably acknowledge the elephant in the room.
There's no way! No one could just deflect the Emerald Splash!
In general, my opinion on stands having multiple unrelated abilities is kind of mixed, because it just happens sometimes. Like, what correlation do Aerosmith, Diver Down, and Whitesnake have, other than the fact that they all have some ability unrelated to their main one? But I think the Emerald Splash is probably my favorite example of this happening, because Kakyoin does something very interesting with his 2 abilities. Despite them being completely unrelated, he uses them in conjunction with each other very well throughout his fights. And even if supposedly
no one could just deflect the Emerald Splash!
The Emerald Splash actually isn't too powerful, so it still prevents Kakyoin's strategy from becoming too monotonous like Jotaro, Volraps, and Avdol's often do. But I could talk about how well the stand is set up all day. That doesn't mean Araki necessarily uses its potential to its full extent. Luckily for Kakyoin and his stand, Araki does use them to their full extent in their fights, at least in my opinion. And there are 2 big examples that I really want to use to demonstrate this. The first of which is actually Kakyoin's very first fight after joining the Crusaders, Tower of Grey. Despite Despite being matched up against one of the most boring enemy stands in the entire part, Kakyoin still manages to make the fight interesting through his use of his abilities. As I'm sure you're all aware, Tower of Grey is very small and very fast, making it difficult to hit. So what does Kakyoin do to counter this? He uses the Emerald Splash, an ability that previously seemed like a basic offensive attack, as a trap, forcing Tower of Grey to move in a specific, readable pattern while Kakyoin unravels Hierophant's legs. And once everything was in place and prepared... Don't get me wrong, this fight is far from one of the best in JoJo. It's short and kind of repetitive, but it's the perfect introduction to Kakyoin's fighting style. While stuff like this becomes somewhat commonplace in later parts of JoJo, no one fought this strategically in Stardust Crusaders aside from Joseph, who barely got a chance to show his stuff. And for the most part, Kakyoin's fights only go up in quality from here, which leads me to the next big fight that I really wanted to talk about, his part in Dio's world.
But some Canadian. Don't you hate Dio's world?
Look, I don't hate Dio's world, I just have some issues with how JoJo vs. Dio specifically was handled. I even said in my Dio's world video that I enjoy all aspects of the fight before JoJo shows up. And Kakyoin's segment specifically is perfect. I mean, if I want to talk about Kakyoin using his abilities creatively and in conjunction with each other, what better way to demonstrate it than what I would consider to be the ultimate form of both of his abilities? The 20-meter Emerald Splash is pretty obvious, but judging by the design of the Hierophant barrier, I would assume that it's also tied to Hierophant's unraveling ability, with my personal theory being that it's Hierophant fully unraveled and wrapped around. After all, we're shown that Hierophant can go pretty far just by unraveling a single foot. So essentially what Kakyoin did was use Hierophant's unraveled strands as tripwire, which would trigger Emerald Splashes when touched. So by taking both of his abilities to the logical extreme, Kakyoin creates the perfect trap that if up against anyone other than Dio or Vanilla Ice, would have beaten them, and it's the perfect way to figure out an opponent's stand ability. And even if he does end up losing in the end, it's definitely really cool and not nearly out of the blue as, say, something like Starfinger. It feels like a logical extension of his abilities rather than something just put in there so he can win a fight. And while the talk of Kakyoin using his abilities creatively, using Unravelment to trick Death 13 into thinking he was cut in half and then using that opportunity to possess it was pretty cool as well. But I'm sure now you're thinking that I only mentioned 3 of Kakyoin's 6 or 7 fights. So if that's the case, is Hierophant really that well designed of an interesting combat stand? Well, the answer to that question actually lies with the stand's user, Kakyoin himself, as well as a little writing technique Araki uses, which I like to call stand personalization.
But stands are already the manifestation of the user's soul. They couldn't be any more personalized. You idiot.
You're right, stands are direct representations of the user's soul, but
it's not what you've got, it's what you do with it.
Look at the way Noriaki uses Aerosmith, for example. Even if somebody else had the same stand, who would have thought to say, light the street on fire against Formaggio? Or better yet, look at the different ways that Dio and Diego use the world. Of course, Dio, with his overconfidence and practical god complex, would use Time Stop to gloat and then deliver one single powerful blow to his opponent. On the flip side, Diego, being far more cunning and conniving, uses Time Stop to set up traps. Furthermore, regardless of the stand itself, those intricate strategies that are the core of stand battles still have to be thought up by the users themselves. In fact, some strategies characters come up with are entirely their own and don't even involve using their stand. Going back to Naranjo, look at how he cuts out his tongue against Tiziano and Squallow. That's another character-defining moment for him because nobody else would have thought to lure out his opponents like that. And like my last point, I think Kakyoin is the first stand user in the series who pulls this off consistently and effectively. If you want to talk about the ways he personalizes Hierophant itself, well, look no further than the ability everyone says was forgotten. Sure, Kakyoin may only use possession once in his introduction and then again against Death 13, but I think that's pretty in character for him. I mean, come on, Kakyoin, the well-mannered nice guy of the group using his stand to possess people. Is that really in character? To me, it makes sense that the only times he would do it would be once when he's under the control of a flesh bud, and again when the entire group was backed into a corner, and frankly, he was probably more than a little ticked off. Which is further reinforced when he threatens to kill a baby. But on the flip side, we see Kakyoin repeatedly use certain strategies. In his first fight with Jotaro, he ties him up with Hierophant's tentacles, and then prepares to fire an Emerald Splash while Jotaro's incapacitated. And we see him do this again against lovers. Alternatively, if you want to look at the ways that Kakyoin himself contributes to his fights without even using Hierophant, look at Emperor and the Hanged Man, Death 13, and his final moments in the Dio fight. We're consistently shown that the key part of Kakyoin's character is that he's constantly thinking and trying to rationalize things. And he discerns all 3 stand abilities that I previously mentioned pretty cleverly, all things considered. My personal favorite of these is Death 13, where despite being tied to a pole and choked out with literal eyeballs, yeah, that's a sentence I just said, Kakyoin still manages to deduce that if Death 13's attacks in the dream world can harm him in the real one, then if he carves a message into his arm, he'll be able to see it when he wakes up and somewhat counter Death 13's memory wiping. It goes back to what I said about Kakyoin being the strategist of the group. I don't think any of the other Crusaders would have been able to keep that level of ahead and come up with such a clever strategy. Although, to their credit, as opposed to their overall stand designs, I think the Crusaders are pretty well personalized throughout their fights. I still think Kakyoin does it best, but the others' personalities still do shine through quite well during their combat scenarios, although that's not always for the better, i.e. Jotaro's direct personality, meaning that Star Platinum is actually encouraged to just punch its way out of scenarios even more than it already is. So, what was the point of this video? Well, there wasn't one. Okay, but in all seriousness, if you want to understand the point I'm trying to make, just look at Star Platinum, Silver Chariot, and Magician's Red and compare them to stand in future parts, like Crazy Diamonds, Sticky Fingers, or Scary Monsters. Then take Hierophant and compare them to those same stands. It still definitely isn't one-to-one. I do believe that Araki got far better at designing stands after Part 3, but to me at least, a Hierophant feels like it follows the design philosophy of these stands and others like them more than most of, if not every other stand in Stardust Crusaders. Just going over the list one more time, a simple ability that can be applied in multiple creative ways? Check. Specific uses for that ability that are applied more often than others? Check. Moments that are less about the stand and more about the stand users themselves, using their head in a way that suits their personality? Check. Am I crazy? Surely I can't be the only one who sees these parallels just with Kakyoin and not with the other Stardust Crusaders. Regardless of my mental state, I hope this video gave you a little bit more appreciation for Kakyoin. And so that next time you think about just how great JoJo fights are, you can take a moment to remember everyone's favorite cherry liquor, and his stand that was so cool, Araki ripped it off 2 more times and just made it bound to the user instead.